Most people imagine a queen's life beginning with grandeur, with golden carriages and triumphant crowds, with years of careful preparation. But for Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, it began with a letter. One letter, in the summer of 1761, and everything she had ever known was over. She was 17 years old and living in Miro, a small, quiet duchy in northern Germany that most of Europe had never heard of and never thought about. The castle she grew up in sat beside a lake, ringed by dense woodland, the kind of place that felt removed from the world by more than just distance. The rooms were modest for royalty. The life was modest, too. Charlotte was the youngest daughter of a minor duke, and after her father died when she was just 8 years old, the family settled into a kind of dignified simplicity. There was not much money. There was not much influence. But there was music. From a young age, Charlotte played the harpsichord. She had been taught by a composer named Johann Georg Linicki, and she was, by all accounts, genuinely talented. Not performed talent, not polished for show talent, but the real kind, the kind that comes from actually loving a thing. She also read botany, literature, natural history, theater. She spoke French. She was learning Italian and Latin. She embroidered, she danced. She was taught how to manage a household with the quiet efficiency that was expected of a well-raised girl of her station. She was, in the language of the time, respectable and suitably accomplished. She was also, by the standards of European courts, entirely unknown. And then, a Hanoverian minister in London named Baron von Munchausen placed her name on a list of minor German princesses, a list being read by a young king who had just inherited the British throne and needed a wife. The reason Charlotte's name was put forward was not her talent or her warmth or her love of botany. It was something far more calculated. She was 17. She had no political connections. She had no experience of power and no interest in acquiring it. She came from a small, insignificant duchy that had no complicated alliances with Britain's enemies. She would not meddle. That was the word used later, in fact. George III himself instructed her, shortly after their wedding, not to meddle. And that instruction, delivered to a teenager who had just crossed the North Sea to marry a stranger in a country whose language she did not yet speak, tells you almost everything about what a royal marriage meant for a woman in 1761. Charlotte arrived in England on the 7th of September, 1761. The crossing had been brutal. The ship encountered violent storms, and she arrived in a state of physical exhaustion. She was thin, pale, and weakened by seasickness. She had no time to recover. Within hours of landing, she was rushed to St. James's Palace for a wedding that had been announced to the public before she had ever met the groom. She wore a gown of violet velvet trimmed with ermine, so heavy that observers noted it was almost impossible for her slight frame to support it, diamonds at her throat, a tiara, lace at her sleeves. Her gown was so laden with jewels and fabric that the writer Horace Walpole noted, with barely disguised amusement, that the ermine mantle was so heavy the crowd could see rather more of her than was intended. She met George III for the first time that day. She threw herself at his feet in the traditional gesture of deference, and he raised her up, took her hand, and walked her through the garden into the palace. A few hours later, they were married in the Chapel Royal. Think about what that means for a moment. She was 17. She had spent her life in a quiet lakeside castle in Germany. And now she was Queen of Great Britain. That evening, after the ceremony, after the state dinner, after hours of being observed and assessed and commented upon by a court that had already decided she was plain and provincial, Charlotte sat down at the harpsichord and played, and the room fell quiet. It was perhaps the one moment that evening where she was entirely herself. The early years of the marriage were genuinely happy. That is not sentiment. It is documented in letters, in court records, in the accounts of those around them. George was 22, intellectually curious, and shy in the way that people who have been raised in enormous institutions sometimes are. Charlotte was warm, good-humored, and possessed of what contemporaries described as a lively but equable temper. They duetted together, she on the harpsichord, he on the flute. They attended plays and concerts. When they were not at court, they preferred the rural informality of Kew and Windsor over the rigid protocol of the London palaces. They were so informal, in fact, that a lady at court named Mary Coke was scandalized one summer evening in 1769 when she heard that the king, the queen, Charlotte's visiting brother, and a single lady-in-waiting had walked through Richmond entirely unattended, without servants. Lady Coke declared that she was not satisfied with the propriety of a queen walking in town unattended. The king and queen apparently did not care. But the domestic picture, warm as it was, had its own architecture of constraint. Charlotte bore 15 children, 15 pregnancies over roughly 20 years. The eldest, the future George IV, was born in August 1762, less than a year after the wedding. Then came Frederick, then William, then Charlotte, then Edward, then Augusta, then Elizabeth, then Ernest, then Augustus, then Adolphus, then Mary, then Sophia, then Octavius, then Alfred, then Amelia. 13 of those 15 children survived to adulthood. Charlotte was responsible for their early education. She selected and supervised their governesses and tutors. She managed the households at Kew and Windsor. She was also expected to appear at court, to host, to represent, to maintain the ceremonial functions of the monarchy with grace and composure. She was a patron of the arts and a deeply interested amateur botanist who helped expand Kew Gardens. The famous South African flower Strelitzia reginae was named in her honor. She read widely. She maintained a large private library filled with books on botany, literature, and theater. She kept a Papillon spaniel close by her side. She was also known, quietly, to use snuff, not unusual for the Georgian era, but one of the small private habits that humanize a figure history often flattens into ceremony. And all of this, the children, the culture, the careful management of a royal household, was done within the boundaries of a role that was defined before she ever arrived. She was consort. She was mother. She was not supposed to influence. She was not supposed to interfere. She was not, in any formal sense, supposed to have opinions about anything beyond the domestic sphere. Yet she had them. Her private letters to her brother Charles, kept and studied by historians, reveal a woman acutely aware of the limits placed around her, and quietly frustrated by them. For the first 25 years of their marriage, Charlotte and George built something that genuinely resembled a partnership. Not an equal one. The laws and structures of the time made equality impossible, but a real one. A life of shared habits, shared tastes, shared space, and what appears to have been shared affection. And then, in 1788, everything changed. George III began showing symptoms that his doctors could not explain and had no language to describe. He became agitated, incoherent at times. He spoke without stopping, sometimes for hours. His behavior grew erratic, then frightening. The illness came on in episodes. The first major crisis in 1788 and 1789, then again in 1801, and then, from around 1810, it became permanent. Medical historians have debated for decades what he actually suffered from. Porphyria was the diagnosis proposed in the 1960s. More recently, researchers have leaned toward severe mental illness. The truth is that the medicine of the time had no concept that could contain what was happening to him. What the medicine of the time did have was cruelty dressed up as treatment: arsenic powder, leeches, purgatives, ice baths. A physician named Francis Willis, who ran a private asylum in Lincolnshire and believed that all mental illness could be controlled through rigid behavioral discipline, was brought in. The treatments were, by any modern understanding, forms of torture. Charlotte had asked for Willis's help. She had initiated the search for someone who could reach her husband, and she was also, from this point forward, terrified of him. His episodes included outbursts of violence. The man she had played music with walked through Richmond with, raised 15 children alongside, that man was still somewhere inside the deteriorating king, but she could not always find him. Their lives separated. They lived increasingly apart. She moved to Kew Palace with several of their daughters, while George's condition was managed at Windsor. She was in her 40s, and then her 50s, and then her 60s, and she was, in all but name, a woman managing a constitutional and personal crisis largely alone. When her eldest son, George, was appointed Prince Regent in 1811, the formal acknowledgement that his father would never recover, Charlotte had already been living with that reality for years. Her correspondence from this period is careful. She was always careful. But even through the careful language, the weight is there. The loneliness, the duty, the impossible position of a woman who loved a man she could no longer reach, and who could not show the world how much that cost her. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz died on the 17th of November, 1818, at Kew Palace. She was 74 years old. Several of her children were at her side. George III, who had been entirely incapacitated for years by then, was almost certainly unaware of her death when it came. He died 14 months later, probably never knowing she was gone. She had been Queen of Great Britain for 57 years. No woman before or since has held that position for longer. What did she leave behind? Kew Gardens, partly. The tradition of the British Christmas tree. She introduced it in 1800, decorating one at Windsor for the children of the town, hanging it with sweets and candles. A library, music. 15 children, and through them, a line that runs directly to Queen Victoria, to every monarch since. Her portrait was reproduced so many times after 1762 that it became one of the most recognizable images of the Georgian era. But there is something else she left behind, something harder to catalog. She left behind a record of what it meant to love inside a structure that did not allow for private grief or for personal agency, or for any life that was not first and foremost a life of duty. She was chosen from a list. She was told not to meddle. She bore 15 children, managed 3 households, supervised the education of a future king, helped run the country while her husband's mind collapsed. And she did all of it without ever having been asked if she wanted to. That is not unique to Charlotte. It is, in fact, the shape of almost every royal woman's life for centuries before and after her. The crowns were visible. The cost was not. Women across history have been selected, transported, renamed, reinvented, and asked to be grateful for the privilege of giving everything they had to roles they never chose. Charlotte was, in many ways, better off than most. She found genuine warmth in her marriage, genuine pleasure in her music and her books, genuine satisfaction in her botanical work and her patronage of the arts. She was not miserable, but she was not free. And the question she leaves us with, the quiet, persistent question, is not whether she was happy. It is whether happiness was ever really hers to pursue on her own terms. Women today still navigate versions of that question. The shapes have changed. The structures have shifted. But the negotiation between who you are and who the world requires you to be, that has not disappeared. It has only moved. The crown was always visible. The woman wearing it had to learn to disappear. If there is another place and time in women's history you would like to see reconstructed, another life lived in the margins of a world that wasn't built for her, leave it in the comments. These stories are waiting to be told.